Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion, and Happy New Year. This is our first episode of 2024. I want to talk to you today about Douglas Wilson, Kevin DeYoung, and thin-skinned evangelicalism. Now, some of you may well be aware of an interchange that took place towards the end of last year. I think it was just at the end of November and the beginning of December, between two quite well-known figures in the United States, Kevin DeYoung and Douglas Wilson. For those who aren't familiar with these characters, let me just very briefly sketch out who they are for you. I don't follow either of them very, very closely, but I've read a fair bit from each of them and appreciated a lot from both. I'm certainly not an expert on either, but in broad brushstrokes, Kevin DeYoung is a well-known writer, pastor, theologian. He has authored many books. He is very much involved in the Gospel Coalition. Without wanting to use loaded terms, he would be seen by some as very much part of the evangelicalism, the sort of established evangelicalism of the US. So sort of mainstream, well-known leaders such as Tim Keller, John Piper, and Kevin DeYoung, to some extent, would be seen as something of a grouping of well-known evangelical leaders in the US. Douglas Wilson, by contrast, leads something of a movement based in Moscow, not the real Moscow, but it's one of those many place names in America named after the original European cities, and there's a real community there of people seeking to live very deliberately, counterculturally. And they have schools and a university and churches. They put out a great deal of content, books, podcasts, videos. They've even launched a new streaming platform. And it's a kind of Christianity that seeks to engage the culture in quite a punchy and front-footed way. Now, Kevin DeYoung took to his keyboard towards the end of November to give his view on Douglas Wilson and what he called the Moscow mood. And it offers a very interesting insight into some of the debates going on within Christianity in the States. And I hope what will become clear over the next few minutes is I'm not really seeking to take a side as such in my comments, although I think it will become clear which side I gravitate towards more. But rather, I think that in this interchange, there's a great deal that we need to learn on this side of the Atlantic. I probably don't know either individual well enough to try and advocate or condemn, should I even want to, them as a whole, but rather there are things that we need to learn from this interchange. So what I'm going to do is just take you through some elements of Kevin DeYoung's initial critique, and really the headline is this: how is it that evangelicalism, mainstream evangelicalism, sees a figure like Douglas Wilson as a target to be shot down, rather than, at the very least, as someone who has a point? And I'd like us to try and make this distinction between being perfect or totally in the right and having a point. Douglas Wilson doesn't claim to be perfect. He doesn't claim to always get it right. But what I want to critique is this attitude of someone like him needs to be shot down comprehensively and warned against, rather than actually what can we learn here. Maybe you can even do both those things, and sometimes we need to. But my main concern with Kevin DeYoung's article is that it doesn't really show any real awareness of the issues that really are at stake and the points that Douglas Wilson does have to make. So without further ado, let's jump in and just look at some of the comments that Kevin DeYoung made. Of course, I'll put the links to the full articles, both Kevin DeYoung's article and Douglas Wilson's response, in the description. So one thing that certainly Douglas Wilson appreciated about Kevin DeYoung's article was the manner in which it was done. There was a generosity, there was a seriousness to the critique, and Kevin DeYoung was able to acknowledge, to some extent, credit where credit was due. And that's what makes for an interesting and helpful, constructive interchange. And certainly that's something that Wilson seems to have appreciated. Here's one of the things that Kevin DeYoung mentioned as a sort of positive. Here's what he says about Wilson. Wilson offers the world and the church an angular, muscular, forthright Christianity in an age of compromise and defection. And I think Kevin DeYoung is quite right to point this out as something that is distinctive and attractive. But what I don't see in Kevin DeYoung's writing here is that self-reflection which would lead to the question, now why is the church, and we're talking primarily about the church here, Kevin DeYoung's concern is that good Christians are being attracted to Moscow, and he thinks that fundamentally that's a bad thing. The thought never seems to occur to Kevin DeYoung, or the question, why are people going to Moscow? Or to put it another way, what are they missing here? What is it that mainstream evangelicalism is not giving them that Moscow is, or at least is perceived to be, giving them? And there doesn't seem that sort of self-reflection. There doesn't seem that openness to the implicit, if nothing else, criticism. Of course, there is explicit criticism as well coming out of Moscow, but the implicit criticism, the very fact that people are going elsewhere, well, what is it that we're lacking in mainstream evangelicalism? Even if there is a plank in Wilson's eye, what about the speck in our own? Won't we at least attend to the speck, even if it's only a speck? What I've found about Kevin DeYoung, I say I appreciate the guy, and I've got some of his stuff at home, read it with the kids, and I certainly appreciate his forthrightness, his clarity, and the fact he does take these things on. Where he sees a problem, he believes there's a problem, he goes for it, and that's all to the good. But I found that Kevin DeYoung is very quick to shoot down, less quick to receive and process the implicit, if nothing else, criticism that there is. So, for example, he would join others in fighting against the so-called emergent church, and I would agree with him in that. Good to critique and warn against the dangers of that movement. But is he as quick to think, well, why are people going in that direction? Is there something in our churches that is overly rigid, even religious in the wrong sense? Are people missing a relational warmth? Have we not encouraged people to express themselves in appropriate ways through the arts? Have we turned this into a cold, logical form of Christianity? Of course, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but maybe something needs to be thrown out. Maybe something needs to change. There was a number of years ago a kind of poem, a spoken word by a young man along the lines of Jesus hates religion. The point he was trying to make was he was trying to drive this distinction between Jesus and religion. And again, I would say he had a point. Was it perfectly expressed? No. But he had a point. And DeYoung wrote a kind of public letter to this guy online. And they actually had a very positive interchange. And the young fella was very humble, really. And I think was, if anything, over-apologetic in receiving pretty much everything Kevin DeYoung had to say. And I think Kevin DeYoung assumed, due to his age and standing, quite a sort of paternalistic sort of position in that interchange. And I'm sure it was well-meaning and maybe even necessary. But what we didn't see was that sense of, what is this young man trying to say that actually does need to be said? It's almost as if there's never a problem here. That's my concern. It's almost as if whatever's going on here, if someone's upset, if someone's looking into something else, well, it can't possibly be because we've given them any reason to look elsewhere. It must just be folly or bad motives, and that's the end of the story. So what I'm wanting to see here, and I'm thinking about us here in the UK, is really, do we ever open ourselves up to criticism? Are we willing to repent? I want to, again, express gratitude for Graham Nichols from Affinity, who hosted this online symposium recently. One of the very few public figures in the church to say, can we at least talk about our response to COVID-19? And where have we gone wrong, if we've gone wrong? And don't we need to repent if we have gone wrong? We need to say sorry. The Lord is willing to forgive, but we need to be willing to accept that correction. But that's extremely rare here in the UK. How much reflection is there going on? How many people are willing to say, do you know what, I got that really wrong? My concern is that we here, just as much of evangelicalism in the States, we are thin-skinned. I remember one person saying that we need to have tough feet or hard feet and soft hearts. All too often it's the other way around. We have hard hearts and we have soft feet. And I'm concerned we have a kind of thin-skinned evangelicalism that in a moment like this with Kevin DeYoung and Douglas Wilson, or with the Moscow phenomenon, we're very slow to say, well, maybe they haven't got it all right, but maybe they've got something right. And maybe we're lacking something and we can learn from them. One of the main points of Kevin DeYoung's critique is, to put it in his words, I'm convinced the appeal of Moscow is visceral more than intellectual. In short, people are moving to Moscow, whether literally or spiritually, because of a mood. It's a mood that says we are not giving up and we are not giving in. We can do better than negotiate the terms of our surrender. The infidels have taken over our Christian laws, our Christian heritage, and our Christian lands, and we're coming to take them back. Now, it's interesting the way in which Kevin DeYoung seeks to frame this issue. You could say there's a subtle criticism being made that those who go to Moscow, he quite clearly says they're not unintellectual people, but he's trying to suggest that it's not for thinking reasons that they've gone there. Rather, it's for emotional reasons. And that's a subtle undermining, you could say, of the movement. We Christians, evangelicals, Orthodox people, mindful that these labels can mean different things on different sides of the Atlantic, we are thinking people. We care about doctrine. We care about logic. And so to suggest that something is emotional rather than intellectual is to subtly undermine it. But I want to suggest that actually what's going on here is not emotional as opposed to intellectual. First of all, I'd say emotional isn't quite the right term here, or as he puts it, visceral. Visceral refers to the guts, doesn't it? But I think what people are really being attracted by, and this is only one small part of it, as Wilson says in his reply, people are attracted by all sorts of things as they come to Moscow. It could be the community, it could be Christian education, it could be cultural engagement, it could be the worship. But those who are drawn by the sort of thing that Kevin DeYoung's getting at, well, I think we could call that heart. It's a sense of courage. It's a sense of we're not giving up, as he says. Now, the idea of we're not giving up, we're coming to take our land back, I wouldn't say that's emotional as such. I'd say that's about heart. It's about having guts. It's about having fight, courage. I mean, if we were to say that Churchill was all about mood when he gave rousing speeches to say we're not going to give up, victory at all costs, that's what we have in sight. Well, no, it's not really. Yes, it's emotional, but it's not nothing but emotion. It's actually a determination to fight, and that kind of morale, that ambition makes all the difference in whether you win or lose. And so one of the big problems I think we have, certainly here on this side of the Atlantic, and for everything I'm saying, if there's a problem over there in the States, times it by 1,000, that's what we've got here. I mean, if we had even 20 even 10 well-known evangelical leaders on this side of the Atlantic who would speak clearly against the baby genocide, we'd be in a different situation altogether. In America, you've got dozens and dozens and dozens, and some of them are the ones who are actually coming under fire by the likes of Wilson for not being hardcore enough. So any problem that we think is over there, it's 1,000 times the size over here. But what we've got as a problem here in the UK especially is we've got peacetime leaders in a time of war. We've got chamberlains who think we can make a treaty, we can stave off the enemy. Maybe the enemy's not that bad in the first place. Maybe the enemy maybe he's not the enemy. Maybe he's a friend. Maybe his motives are pure after all. Maybe people think too ill of him, and maybe we can all just get along. And maybe we don't have to go to war. Maybe we don't have to die. But the reality is, culturally speaking, morally speaking, spiritually speaking, we live in a time of war. And what we have is too many Chamberlain leaders when we need Churchills. We've got peacetime leaders in a time of war. And actually, even if we go with Kevin DeYoung's point to some extent, okay, let's say the problem isn't intellectual. In a sense, I'm willing to agree. It's not really our doctrine. It's not even our position, our theoretical position on things like the baby genocide. It's about whether we're willing to stand up and fight. It's a question of heart. And this is where the slur evangellyfish is actually not too off the mark, because jellyfish is not only wibbly wobbly and they don't have any backbone, well, they don't have any heart either. And I think our problem in the UK when it comes to things like the baby genocide, it's not that we don't understand. There is that problem, but it's not fundamentally that we don't understand that it's wrong to kill babies. That's not complicated. The question is, are we willing to stand and fight for that? And the answer in almost every case is no. It's a lack of heart. So if Douglas Wilson's giving us heart or calling us out into courage, well, again, doesn't mean he's perfect, doesn't mean he's doing it without fault, but maybe there's something there. Kevin DeYoung makes quite an uncompromising charge fairly early on in his article in saying that these mood-related elements that are drawing people to Moscow, he says they are, some of them at least, incompatible with Christian virtue. And there's the big charge, that there's a great deal about Douglas Wilson, says Kevin DeYoung, that is incompatible with Christian virtue. And his final judgment really is Wilson's doing more harm than good. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for Christianity. Now, again, when we look at the word virtue, it's important, I think, that we pause and think about what that word really means. It's related to the Latin word for courage, and that itself is related to the Latin word for man. So manliness, courage. Interestingly, what Kevin DeYoung has already acknowledged is that Wilson does offer a kind of angular, muscular, forthright Christianity that many feel attracted to. Why? Because so much of our Christianity has become feminized and compromising and lacking any definition whatsoever, let alone angles. So the question is Douglas Wilson really, or what he advocates, is it really incompatible with Christianity? Is it fundamentally at odds with Christ? And it seems that the basic reason why Kevin DeYoung says yes, it is, the thing that he really seems to not be able to handle is that Douglas Wilson will criticize quite strongly other Christians and Christians that Kevin DeYoung perceives to be conservative, we're on the same side, orthodox Christians. Let me quote for you from Kevin DeYoung's article. Wilson takes a swipe at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission and at the G3 conference. Both are conservative Baptist groups, we might add, that would be on the same side as Wilson in almost every important cultural battle. It's fine if Wilson wants to disagree with these groups. They disagree with him at times. But Wilson doesn't mention them in the video in order to make a serious argument. He uses them for a punchline. If you like Wilson, you are supposed to think, oh no, he didn't. That's hilarious. And if you like the ERLC or G3, you are supposed to be triggered. because if Moscow can watch their opponents get triggered, that is also funny. When serious criticism is leveled at Moscow, the response often includes a smattering of mockery and memes. This isn't Wilson using his famous serrated edge to make a prophetic point against a godless culture. This is intentionally making fun of other Christians for a quick chuckle. I want to point out two things here. One is Kevin DeYoung really underestimates what's at stake here. There's a problem that Wilson sees that Kevin simply will not acknowledge exists. Now, Wilson's very clear to say that he considers people like Kevin DeYoung his brothers in Christ. He doesn't see them as the enemy. And indeed, he often reaches out to people like Kevin DeYoung and seeks to work with them, invite them to Moscow, and so on. But there are people who represent a problem. They may well be real believers, but there are people who represent a problem to the extent that they are, functionally speaking, on the other side. They are fighting on the other side. They're not allies, actually. They are the problem. When it comes to something like the baby genocide, there are Orthodox, conservative, evangelical Christians who are not allies. Well, not allies to us anyway. They're allies of the other side. They're helping the abortion industry to cover up abortion. They're helping the abortion industry to get people elected who will support abortion. A great example of this is the late Tim Keller, and we've done a whole episode on this on a blog. Tim Keller is seen by much of the world as one of the leading conservative evangelical leaders, authors, pastors, theologians. He said that whilst the Bible does tell us abortion is wrong, and I can only find him saying that once publicly. Maybe he's done it more than once, but he avoided talking about abortion like the plague, and he actually taught people to avoid talking about abortion. He advocated that very deliberately, very explicitly. But Tim Keller said, whilst the Bible tells us that abortion is wrong, it doesn't tell us which policies or which parties will best serve the interests of the unborn child. Now, one could almost be forgiven for saying that here in the UK when every major party is either actively, aggressively pro-abortion, or it's just so passive, like the Conservative Party, that it just allows pro-abortion bills to go through unchecked. One could almost get away with saying that here because we don't have a pro-life party. But this was in the United States at a time when there was one party pushing to abolish Roe v. Wade, and there's another party pushing for abortion up till birth for any reason. Now, it's true the Bible doesn't tell you which party to vote for in that situation, but a 5-year-old could tell you which party to vote for in that situation. And so what you're actually seeing there is a deliberate, stubborn, ideologically driven resistance to being clear about the applications of our Christianity in the real world. It is impossible to maintain that the Democrats might have done more for the unborn child than the Republicans. One could have a reasonable conversation about other policies and how you weigh different policies, although I'm very comfortable with saying that when it comes to baby genocide, that is an issue that trumps almost any other issue you can imagine. But that wasn't Keller's point. Keller's point was, look, who can say which of these parties would best serve the interests of the unborn child? That is a cop-out. It's a morally reprehensible cop-out. And these are the people that are upheld as great models for us all. This increasingly common attachment to being so-called nuanced, sophisticated, not far-right, not single issue, not fundamentalist. In truth, it lacks courage. It lacks clarity. In fact, it lacks basic common sense and logic. But this is becoming increasingly common, not only in the States, but especially here in the UK. We almost idolize this non-committal approach to public engagement. So whereas Kevin DeYoung thinks, hey, look, we're on the same side here. These guys would agree with you on almost every major point. Well, the question is, do they agree with you? I get that all the time. I get people saying we would be in agreement with you on abortion. And I'm thinking, well, why not say we are with you? Why not do something? Why not join the fight? Babies are being killed every day, hundreds of them. Would be doesn't really do anything. And so there's this non-committal, well, we would be in agreement with you. We would agree. but we're not actually agreeing. And so it is precisely because Kevin DeYoung doesn't see the problem here. He doesn't see the damage that these little compromises are making or are doing, that he doesn't think that Wilson's criticism of them is warranted, is reasonable. The second observation I want to make here is I don't think Kevin DeYoung really gets the point of satire when Wilson's using it. He seems to adopt this rather reductionist interpretation that it's just for chuckles. It's this kind of nothing buttery. It's this insinuation that Wilson's just doing this to show off to his friends and have a laugh. But again, let's think about it. Is it possible there is a real issue here that needs critiquing or even making fun of? Why is Wilson making fun of these people and these things and not other people or other things? Is there nothing here? Has he not got a point? We could disagree over the form, the appropriateness. There'll be times when Wilson's gone too far. Perhaps there'll be times when he hasn't gone far enough. I, for my money, think that often Wilson's doing actually what's necessary to cut through. And we see this in all sorts of prophets, social reformers. You have to be sharp enough to cut through. One of the biggest problems for reformers and prophets is being ignored. That's almost the worst thing, is being ignored. Being hated, well, that's part of the course. But being ignored, you can't really get the message through. Now, that doesn't justify anything. It doesn't justify sin. But we can see with the prophets, with Ezekiel, with John the Baptist, with Jesus himself, we see use of sarcasm. We see the use of name-calling and graphic imagery and really very disturbing metaphors and similes being used. We see people being named publicly, humiliated even. And so clearly Jesus, John the Baptist, the prophets, the apostles thought that this kind of stuff was sometimes necessary. And evangelicals will tend to say they think criticism is necessary. And I found they're all in favor of it, so long as you anonymize the targets, qualify your criticism to death, and make sure there are no concrete calls to action. I think one place in which Kevin DeYoung's critique, well, when I first read it, there were two things I thought were reasonable. Now I think there's just one thing, having looked into it a bit more. But one thing where I thought he's got a point. Kevin DeYoung has got a point, and I think Piper many years ago was critiquing Wilson about something, and he talked about raising a yellow flag rather than a red, a sort of warning flag. And I would be sympathetic to that in this case, in terms of Wilson's personality, his image, this kind of personality cult. He is a very compelling person. He's very talented. He's witty. He's intelligent. And no doubt some people will follow him, whether from afar or up close, because of his personality. And I think that when I saw this year's No Quarter November video, I did think, was it a bit gratuitous? You know, these prolonged up-close shots of his face and so on. And perhaps a small yellow flag there. Such a criticism could be made of almost any well-known person, but I think those who are especially charismatic, especially talented, probably need to be especially careful that you don't have people idolizing you and so on. And so I would be cautious about trying to market my personality to that degree. Something of a yellow flag, perhaps. But even if he is too much, whether it's in his language, the style of videos, whatever, even if it's too much, are we saying that it's not in the right direction? Or are we saying that it hasn't got the ability to pull us in the right direction, even if we can't go all the way and agree on everything? We don't apply that those criteria to other people. No one says, well, if Keller isn't perfect, we won't listen to anything he has to say, or Kevin DeYoung, indeed, or Piper. But with Douglas Wilson, somehow the bar is set at 100%. And if there's anything wrong he's ever said, apparently we're meant to discount the whole thing. It's interesting to remember that Martin Luther, the great reformer, was anti-Semitic, quite atrociously so. Was he right in that? Absolutely not. It was terribly wrong. But did Luther have a point? Yes, he had a point. And we owe a huge amount to him. Towards the end of Kevin DeYoung's piece, he outlines what he would rather Wilson was doing. I'll again quote directly. But Wilson's online persona is not about introducing reformed creeds and confessions, or about explaining the books of the Bible, or about global mission to the uttermost parts of the earth, or about liturgy, preaching, prayer, and the ordinary means of grace. I'm sure Wilson cares about all those things, but that's not what No Quarter November and his self-promotional trailers are selling. By and large, it's not what the other 11 months of videos and tweets and memes and blog posts are selling either. Wilson may be a happy warrior, but it is easier to spot his happiness in the war itself than in the things he claims to be fighting for. We could do with fewer witticisms, front and centre, and more conspicuous delighting in the sweetness of fellowship with Christ and exulting in the love of God our Saviour. And if Wilson and Canon Press believe that their bread and butter really is about all the things I listed a few seconds ago, creeds, confessions, the Bible, missions, the ordinary means of grace, I'd love to see them devote an entire month, hey, why not a whole year, to just those things, without any snark, without any sarcasm, and without any trolling of other Christians. We must never forget that no matter how important Western civilization may be, we're still sojourners and exiles in the world. 1 Peter 2:11. The most important fight is the fight for faith, not the fight for Christendom. The Christian life must be shaped by the theology of the cross, however much we might prefer an ever-present theology of glory. Now, this is very interesting because what Kevin DeYoung's saying here is he just wishes that Wilson would retreat back into, as it were, pure theology, rather than applied theology. If only Wilson would just keep to the creeds, confessions, the Bible, missions, and ordinary means of grace, and just leave all the culture war stuff. Just put it down. And interestingly, Wilson does care about all those things, as he points out in his reply. He's written books on almost all those things. The bread and butter of life in Moscow, apparently, according to those who live there and worship there, is centered around those things. But perhaps what Wilson is best known for from afar, because it's rare, because it's very impactful, is the sharper cultural engagement stuff. And DeYoung's basically saying, look, if you could just drop all the snark and just carry on being nothing more than a regular pastor, just keep your head down, sort of retreat a bit more back into churchianity and leave all the Christendom stuff out, then we could commend what you're doing. And what's interesting here is, again, there's a problem that Kevin DeYoung is not seeing. And there's a dichotomy that he is seeking to maintain. He says the most important fight is the fight for faith, not the fight for Christendom. Now, at one level, I can agree with Kevin DeYoung, at one level. But the problem is he's suggesting there is no inherent connection, relationship between Christendom and faith. We only have to look at our own nation and see that as Christendom has been shrinking, so has Christianity. Billy Graham came to our nation once in the 50s and 60s. He came again a couple of decades later. The results were very, very different. Same gospel, same preacher. What had changed? Well, the culture had changed. The whole plausibility structure around Christianity had changed. People grown up in a more secularized culture. What they were getting from schools was different. What they were getting from the TV was different. What they knew about the Bible was different. And there is a real connection. It might be an oversimplification to say that culture can form as pre-evangelism. If we live in a largely Christian culture, people are familiar with the Bible, they've got a basic respect for God's word, maybe even God-fearing in some way, it is going to be more fruitful in general, preaching the gospel to such people than people who have been thoroughly conditioned in the opposite direction. Wilson would certainly not say that we should have a culture that's pretending to be Christian as opposed to people with real vital born-again faith, but rather real born-again faith begets Christian culture, and Christian culture matters for preaching the gospel and seeing people born again. So there is this false dichotomy which we are really into over here in the UK, where we even have the likes of John Stevens telling people, well, don't bother with trying to end the baby genocide. We just need to preach the gospel, plant churches, and wait for revival, and then revival will just sort it automatically. Of course, it's not true, because how can more Christians just like us bring about the end of the baby genocide when Christians like us don't care about the baby genocide? We're not doing anything against the baby genocide. So multiplying us in terms of number won't solve the problem. I don't think you need to be a post-millennial or have a clear eschatology or any of these things to quite simply take the position that as disciples of Christ, as born-again believers, we're commanded as part of the Great Commission to go out and make disciples and to teach them to obey everything Christ taught, which includes loving your neighbor as yourself, includes standing up for righteousness and justice. And so a Christian shouldn't be able to help himself but influence the culture towards righteousness and justice. So I think here we're getting close to the fundamental disagreement between Kevin DeYoung and Wilson. And it's not about vibe or tactics or what levels of sarcasm are appropriate. Really, it's the idea that Christianity can and indeed should prosper regardless of Christendom. That the growth of Christianity is not dependent on or even in any relationship with culture change. That's what Kevin DeYoung doesn't really get, or even he resists. And that's why he thinks that Wilson's going too far. That's why he thinks Wilson is firing at all the wrong people, because Kevin DeYoung can't see the problem. So there is actually an intellectual or a worldview difference here. There is theology that comes into it, or certain attitudes towards what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be God's people in the world. Today, Kevin DeYoung wants to retreat back into church business as usual, kind of pietism, and let the world go its own way. And whether that starts as an intellectual or a doctrinal difference, or whether it starts in the heart, whether it's an issue of courage, whether it's an issue of being prepared to be hated by the world, even by those within the Christian establishment, perhaps it's not possible to say from the outside. But I know that for myself, thoughts and beliefs all too often follow desires and wishes, and it's all too easy to rationalize and justify with theologizing what is in fact a reluctance to join the fray. Kevin DeYoung says, I too would like to see more Christian influence in our land and a return to many of the ideas and ideals that have made Western civilization truly great. But it's that would. I would like to see. We would be in agreement on the cultural issues, but this is wishing, not working. Of course, every Christian would like to see laws that prosper righteousness and justice. The question is, are we willing to stand up and fight for them, or even lay down our lives for them? The question is not what we'd like to see. It's what we're prepared to stand for. Now, I mentioned there were two things that I thought Kevin DeYoung said well when I first read the article. I mentioned one of them, that the cult of personality is maybe an issue that perhaps just Wilson needs to be careful about. But the other, at first glance, was what Kevin DeYoung said about Wilson's language. And he lists several obscene words that Wilson has used in his articles and hyperlinks them all. And you get this impression of a man who is not in control of his tongue, who seems to enjoy obscenity. And when I first saw that, I thought, no, this is bad. We do need to be careful of the language we use. And it's not okay to use some of that language. But of course, it depends on the context. It depends, for example, are you literally just quoting someone else? Are you saying, here's a word you shouldn't use, and you have to say what word it is so people know what word you're talking about? And I didn't follow up every hyperlink, but I did follow a few. And sure enough, one of the worst words that were used was used in such a way that it really was basically quoting someone else. He even said, look, if you don't like that language, that's their language. It's not my language. So he was actually critiquing the language himself. And so it seems rather disingenuous, I'm afraid, for Kevin DeYoung to quote that out of context and suggest that Wilson supports the use of such language in any context for chuckles or for shock factor. It's almost the opposite of what Wilson was actually doing. And I have to say, it feeds into, we're seeing a pattern here developing where Kevin DeYoung, and it's not just him, but he represents something of a movement there, will pick out what they perceive to be the worst, lump it all together, take it out of context, and hope that by doing so they can bring the man down, and then people don't have to listen to him and they won't keep flocking to him. Because the backstory here is that a lot of people are leaving, as it were, the evangelical establishment in America, and they're going to Moscow. And clearly Kevin DeYoung is concerned about this, and that's why he's taken to his keyboard. And so he's trying to really smear Wilson and say, look, this man's he's got a filthy mouth. And as I say, I haven't been through every link, but the ones I saw were Wilson critiquing a culture that does bad things and says bad things, and also critiquing a form of Christianity that's quite happy for these things to be going on and quite happy to use polite language to describe obscene things, which itself is deceptive and bears false witness and helps to sugarcoat evil. Whereas Wilson's saying things how they are, and then he's the one who gets criticized by other Christians for using language that's actually commensurate to the obscenities that need to be opposed. So there's an issue there. There's an issue. And again, it's part and parcel of this form of thin-skinned evangelicalism that doesn't want to hear criticism, doesn't want to self-reflect, doesn't want to see what might be a problem at our end. It's much easier to try and shoot someone like Wilson down and keep people away from him. Wilson, this is DeYoung writing again, knows how to strike a tone that is gracious, wise, resolute, and dare I say winsome. One can only conclude that he prefers to write in a different way. Again, do you see what's going on here? Wilson can write nicely. If he's not writing nicely, it must just be he's decided to be nasty, rather than maybe there's a problem. Maybe this is warranted. Maybe it's necessary for him to use such language. There's this kind of criticism resistance that exists in mainstream evangelicalism. It may be going too far to draw the analogy with the kings and false prophets in the Old Testament who said to the true prophets, the prophets of God, prophesy to us smooth things. Look, talk about the creeds and all the key doctrines, talk about church, talk about church history, talk about missions, but just don't give us all this edgy Christendom stuff. Don't talk about culture wars. Don't talk about making a stand and going on the front foot. Just prophesy to us smooth things. Just say nice things. Don't attack or defend, just build. But as Wilson says, they need armed guards around all the stuff they're building in Moscow, because what traditionally happens is Christians build institutions and then progressives, or whatever you want to call them, come in and take them over. You need armed guards when you're building. And so this is why it's simply false for Kevin DeYoung to say to Wilson, look, have all the positive stuff, keep going with that, but just drop the negative. Well, no, you drop the negative, you're not going to defend the positive. We've got to love what God loves and hate what God hates. We don't have a choice there. We can't just opt for the more comfortable side of that equation. Well, I could go on, but perhaps that's enough for today. The reason I wanted to bring this to your attention is that what we see is the canary in the mine principle. In the States, the problem is less than what we've got here, but those who are on the walls, on the lookout, the watchmen, are sharper. And so Wilson sees something going wrong in America and is calling it out in the American church. But here, we've gone far more wrong than that, and yet we don't seem to have the eagle-eyed watchman on the walls. And so everything that applies to mainstream evangelicalism over there applies 1,000 times more over here. And we need to make sure, if we're serious about pursuing God, if we're serious about being faithful witnesses to Jesus in our generation, in this nation, we can't afford to be so thin-skinned and so criticism resistant that the moment a prophet's raised up, flawed though they will be, not of the level of an Old Testament prophet, no John the Baptist, but someone who has a prophetic message for the church, will we have the humility to listen and to see what point there may be? Or will we be like Kevin DeYoung and just do all we can to undermine their character, smear them, and tell people to stay well away? Well, if we do that, ultimately it'll be to our own harm, because flawed as they may be, these prophets with a small p that the Lord in his mercy raises up at certain times, they're sent for our own good. And the one who heeds correction is helped. The one who refuses correction harms himself. So let's not be like Kevin DeYoung in this article. Let's listen. Let's be humble. Let's receive correction. And in doing so, we can become more like Christ and be a more helpful witness in our generation.